I thought the. Okay, cool. Yeah, if anyone does have any questions as we're going through, ask them. But we have some Q&A at the end as well, so I may defer the answer till later, depending on what you're asking. But feel free to stop at any point. Um, so my name is Rhys Smith, and I work for Janet. Jon Chapman, my colleague, is also in the room, and we're going to talk about Moonshot and what it can do for you. So, some of you may know about Moonshot, some of you may not. Should we use this little hands up and hands down thing? Because I've never used that in one of these rooms before. Who, raise your hand if you know a bit about Moonshot. Leave it down if you don't. Couple of people, and some people who either aren't raising their hand. Okay, right, well, anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to give a quick recap. Anyway, for those of you who don't know much about Moonshot, we're going to go through quickly what it is before we can get to what it can actually do for you. Who's Janet and what we got to do with Moonshot? I think most of you know that already, but we're the UK's NREN, and we run lots of AAI infrastructure. So we run the the SAML-based UK Federation. We run the Jerome instance for the UK. We run the certificate service, and running all of these things led us to believe that our existing services weren't meeting all the needs of our customers. They don't do everything that our customers need them to do. So what do I actually mean by that? Well, so we have identity federation stuff. So SAML, so UK Access Management Federation, Switch AAI, all these kind of federations around Europe, all brought together using EduGain. And they're very good, but they do web stuff. You can kind of hack them to do things beyond the web, but it's not really what it was designed for, and it's not particularly elegant. Got network federation stuff. So Eduroam, brilliant for network roaming, less good if you want to do anything that's not network roaming. You've got certificates, very good for making security claims about users and about clients and about applications and pretty much anything really. But it's not particularly great to work with. Users do not understand certificates, do not understand X509. So we have three solutions, all doing essentially the same thing, allowing security claims to be passed between organizations, and all of them limited due to the kind of the technology they're based on. So we have a set of implementations of federated identity, all of which have different names of objectives, all of which have different technical infrastructure in place, different positives, different negatives, different policy, all a bit fragmented. So that leads to pretty bad customer experience. People have to sign with multiple policies, you have to manage multiple technologies. This costs real money in terms of time and effort and all that kind of stuff. And on top of all of that, it doesn't actually do everything you might want it to do. So if you want to allow federated identity as the way of authenticating to anything that's not web, network, or certificate based, you can't. It's just not really done. So if you want to do federated login to SSH, for example, or federated login to the Windows desktop, you can't. So we had a vision, which was to have a unified approach for all of this, to allow you to secure access to any service, any application, and that's essentially what Moonshot aims to do. So we'll go through some use cases quickly. This kind of will give you an idea of what we were doing when we created Moonshot, and also what it'll show kind of the range of possibilities of things that you can do with it. So within the UK, we have something called the Science and Technologies Facilities Council, government-funded thing, runs the National Grid Service. They currently use X509 authentication for the grid stuff, as everyone in grid does, but it's complex. Users do not like it. It means it's harder for users to use, so the uptake is less. It means people subvert things where possible, so the level of security isn't as high as it was designed for. You have people sharing certificates and things they shouldn't, but they do. So they want to simplify authentication across the distributed computing stuff. So you could use Moonshot instead of X509 authentication, or some kind of bridge between the two. So you could do Moonshot for grid stuff. We have Diamond Light Source, who are the UK's national synchrotron, which is a big particle accelerator thing, except not for physics research like the LHC, but for firing particles of different substances to understand them better. Most countries around the world have one or more of these facilities. They're researchers, and they have 30,000 scientists around Europe who want to use what they call the beamline, which is the accelerator thing. People to make use of this beamline need to sign in, so they need to connect to their systems, submit jobs, and you do that through SSH if you're connecting remotely. If you go on site to actually watch the experiment happen, you want access to physical consoles. So for them, Moonshot means federated authentication to SSH, federated authentication to the Linux console, federated authentication to the GNOME desktop, things like that. We have Cancer Research UK, another a leading charity looking at beating cancer. Their particular kind of things they need to solve that you can't with existing federated identity solutions is quite a lot around sharing of data, actually. So sharing of data within their own organizations, because Cancer Research UK itself is a federated organization. It's made up of several smaller organizations, and between other cancer research organizations, because there's a lot of collaborative work going on. So they need to share data, they need to share documents, they need to also share things like HPC clusters. So we're looking at things like federated authentication for Samba shares, for CIFS, for NFS, or SSH to the HPC clusters, things like that. Again, none of this can really be done at the moment. All this boils down to the use of federated identity to anything. In any deployment model, be it a centralized thing where you have some kind of hub which is managing access to things, be it distributed, where there is no central hub and things talk to each other in kind of a dynamic way, or even be it kind of cloud-based, where all the systems are no longer sat in your data centers. We want to do all of this with any kind of authentication credential. It needs to be agnostic to the technology, and it needs to work at scale. The world of federation at the moment involves a couple of thousand, maybe a couple of tens of thousands of organizations connected together, where services are things like web servers and wireless network controllers, things like that. In a world where potentially anything could be federated, we're now talking down to devices. So you could have every Windows desktop in the world, for example, federated. So all of this needs to work at the scale that federations never had to work at before. So all of this gives you an idea of what we were trying to help fix with Moonshot. So what is Moonshot? Moonshot is essentially a set of technologies that we've bolted together that tries to fix all of these things. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. There are lots of other slide decks and presentations and documentation if you're interested in the detail of how all of this works. At the moment, we're focusing in on roughly what it is and how it can actually help you. So this is about the level of detail we're going to go into. What actually is it? What's it built from? So we took the strongest of parts of each of the technologies that we know about. We could have gone and designed something from scratch that tries to do all this Federation stuff, but what would happen then is nobody would ever adopt it because nobody trusts it, because it's got no history, no background, it's got no proof of the security. It'll never happen. So we decided to take mature, existing, deployed technologies, pick and choose from amongst them to pick the strengths of each of them, and stick them together in new ways. So we use something called EAP, which is an open standard, comes from the IETF, the Internet Engineering Task Force, which gives really strong authentication. If you don't know EAP, which you probably don't, so EAP has different methods associated with it, which means it's flexible. That's the whole point of EAP. You can plug different authentication mechanisms into it. And one which you probably haven't heard of is one called EAP-SIM, which is the authentication method every cell phone in the world uses to authenticate to the cellular network. So it's out on however many billion mobile phones there are in the world. So it's pretty well proven, and it's proven that it scales. We use something called Radius. So that EAP gives us strong ways of authenticating a user. We then use something called Radius as the way that organizations communicate with each other, communicate this authentication information amongst each other. Radius is known to scale very well. Radius is the technology that Eduroam is built on. Eduroam currently over 57 countries or whatever it is at the moment. Tens of thousands of organizations, millions of users. Yeah, that works pretty well. So we do EAP for authentication. We stick it over Radius for allowing organizations to pass this information around each other. But Radius is very good at saying yes and no. It's not very good at saying giving extra information. If all you care about is getting on the wireless network or not, that's fine. You want, in the cases, in the way the Federation works, you want a yes or a no to be given to the wireless access controller to say whether somebody's allowed on the network or not. When we're starting to do things like plug this into SSH and Windows desktops and lots of other things, you might want some extra information so you can make some much more interesting authorization decisions. SAML is extremely good at doing rich authorization and enabling rich semantics. So we stick SAML into the mix and we do SAML over all of this as well. That gives us really strong authentication, really strong authorization, and really nice, flexible way of these organizations talking to each other. And all of this means nothing if you can't integrate with applications. So we integrate with something called the GSS API, which is an IETF standard again. Or it's a way of applications being able to devolve control of authentication to the GSS API. So if you're an application developer, instead of writing authentication stuff, you just make calls to the GSS API and let it deal with it. The GSS API is a plugin, has mechanisms. Kerberos is one of the better known mechanisms. So Kerberos is an instance of the GSS API, just like Moonshot is. So they're kind of sisters in a way. And in fact, we share quite a lot of code and stuff with Kerberos. And in effect, we'll get onto this in a bit, but it means that anything written for Kerberos should work with Moonshot. Not quite as simple as that, but should. That's the GSS API. We also integrate with something called the SSPI, which is Microsoft's own proprietary variant of the GSS API. And it's what the core authentication stuff of Windows is built upon. And we also integrate with SASL, because we have a bridge between GSS and SASL. So anything that uses SASL should be able to use Moonshot. So things like IMAP and few other protocols use SASL. So that's what Moonshot is. It's just that collection of technologies, and it's all put together in a new way. The new way we're putting it together, we're standardizing through the IETF. We now have some RFCs, so proposed standards for the core stuff that we're doing with Moonshot, which is good. So that's what Moonshot is. So how can it help you? Well, first of all, what do you? I mean, we've given you the basic overview of what can help you. What it can do to help you is if you need any kind of authentication or authorization in any application or service you run, and any of the existing technologies don't help you, then Moonshot may well, because it's very, very flexible. So first of all, what do you need to do if you're going to go and do this thing? There are 3 bits to Moonshot. There are identity providers, so users who authenticate to services have a home organization that they're from. They might be from a university or from a business or from wherever. There is a thing they're trying to authenticate to, the relying party, the service. So it could be an SSH server, it could be a Windows desktop, could be an Exchange server, could be a web server, whatever. And of course you have the user. What's needed? If you're doing the IDP part of this, then what you need is a Radius server with the Moonshot extensions on it. Will be a core part of FreeRadius, one of the really popular Radius pieces of software in use. At the moment, it's FreeRadius plus some patches, but they are being put into the core product. You need some kind of identity store, so LDAP or whatever. If you want to do the SAML bits and pieces, you need a SAML server. And that's about it. The user has to have some stuff on their device. This is the one thing that you need to do above and beyond what you do in the SAML Federation. If you're doing SAML stuff, the user doesn't need anything other than the web browser. With Moonshot, just like with Eduroam, you need stuff on the device. In the Eduroam case, this is a supplicant, and it's usually built into the operating system. For now, with us, this is a set of libraries and a way of choosing the identity the user wishes to use to log into the service. So the libraries are distributed through MSIs on Windows, RPMs and Debs on Linux, and there's an installer on the Mac. And in terms of choosing the identity, we have an identity selector that users can use. Or if you're on Windows, you can also use the Windows Credential Manager that's built into the operating system. So if you have a service and a user's going to use it, they need to have something on their device to enable this. You need to have, they all need to have an IDP, which is Moonshot enabled. And if you're running a service, you will need a Radius server somewhere that you connect to. It doesn't have to live on the actual service that you're running. So if you've got an SSH server, for example, you don't need a Radius server on there, but you do need a Radius server somewhere within your organization that you can connect your service to. You have Moonshot libraries on there. Again, MSIs, RPMs, Debs, and installer. And your libraries are essentially configured to talk to the local Radius server, so it passes across authentication. And your service needs to be configured to use GSS or SSP or SASL, which in some cases it may do without you doing anything. In some cases you might need to go and alter a couple of configuration directives. So for example, in SSH you have to go and change the config file and say something like GSS API authentication on, something along those lines. So if you do have services or applications, what is currently supported? Well, as I said, essentially anything that is written properly to use GSS or the SSP will work without modification. It will just work. And most applications and services nowadays are actually written to use one of GSS, API, the SSPI, or SASL. So all of Microsoft stuff, for example, well, most of it uses the SSPI. Lots of Linux stuff uses GSS. And most of the reason for this is because most things are written to include support for Kerberos, which means they include support for the GSS, API, or SSPI, or SASL. Things which are written properly will just work. So, for example, Outlook and Exchange just works. Things which weren't written properly might need some minor modifications because depending on what the writer of the application did, some people make some assumptions about Kerberos which are not valid for non-Kerberos things. So depending on what you're doing, some things just work, some things might need a bit of modification. Where we are finding things that do need modification, we are figuring out how to fix them, and we're sending patches upstream where possible. So practically, you have a task, you're doing a Géant task. What do you need to do if you want federated authentication to whatever your service or application is? Just run through this again. You need to install the moonshots and libraries. You configure your application to use GSS or the SSPI or SASL. You configure a connection on that service to your local radius proxy, which has the Moonshot extensions on it. And that's it, job done. It should work. Beyond that, depending on the service, you might need to think about a few things like mapping of users. People are now doing federated authentication to your service. How is that going to be mapped to users within the service? So the SSH example, how are users mapped to SSH logins? What home space do they have on there? If you're talking, say, Microsoft Exchange, somebody's doing a federated login, which mailbox should they be connected to? And there are different ways you could do this, but that's usually pretty dependent on the application. The advice on how you do mapping to mailboxes is going to be completely different to mappings to SSH services, for example. And that's it. So where are we in terms of development of Moonshot? We've gone through what it is, we've gone through how it can help you and what you need to do. Is this ready to be used yet? Well, in terms of technology, code is all BSD licensed and available in binary form on Linux and as debs and RPMs, but the source is also there. On the Mac, there are installers available, so if anyone wants to do Mac stuff, you might want to drop us a line because there's some big caveats on the Mac at the moment. On the Windows side of things, we have an SSP, which is currently available to the research and education space for free. It's closed source for various reasons, but it is freely available to the research and education community. We have a UI available on Linux and Mac. If you're on Windows, you use the built-in Windows Credential Manager at the moment. We are making our own version, but it's not quite there yet. On top of all of this, we have another thing called Trust Router, which is a way of scaling trust management of all of the Moonshot entities that might appear in the world. That is a piece of software which is out, which is written and works. We have a Trust Router running. I won't go into too much detail here. We'll talk about this another time if anyone's interested. Or drop us a line. And that is available for people in the Janet pilot and the Géant pilot, which I'll talk about in a second. So Janet has been running a pilot since April of last year. It's an 18-month pilot where we're trying to get all the technology in place and essentially figure out, do things like figure out where all the bugs are so we can fix them, but also figure out what this means to actually run in the real world, what this means for us, what this means for our customers, what this means for people running services. There's also a Géant pilot, which is a 2-year project, also began in April 2013. So if you're a Géant task, if you're part of a Géant task, you could use Moonshot through this pilot. So we're looking at non-web single sign-on across 8 NRENs at the moment. We're looking at peering between them because unlike we're trying to, so in the SAML world, we've kind of engineered into federation after the fact. We're trying to get this right from the very start this time, in terms of policy, in terms of technology, in terms of everything. So there is a Géant Moonshot pilot as well. If you are interested anymore, if you want to find out any more, we have URLs on screen where you can go and see the software, you can go see the community group, you can go see the standards at the IETF. Slides should be made available, I imagine. And that's about all I have to say. So, do we have any questions? questions being typed. A question about how you map users. At the moment, well, so it depends entirely on the application. So the question is how are you meant to map users? So, for example, if you're doing stuff in the world of Windows, you can do this directly in Active Directory. So you don't need to write tools, you don't need to write modules. On things like SSH, there will need to be some custom stuff written. Some of our pilot sites in the UK, so Diamond, for example, have some stuff going on where they use a MySQL database to map incoming federated identities to a local SSH server. And this is documented on the Diamond site at the moment, and we'll be putting it up on our documentation soon. So at the moment, it's actually a bit of a mixture of some applications kind of have it built in, some you will have to do some really custom stuff for. As we go through the pilot, where people do common things, like the SSH case, people are always going to want to map users. We will be documenting and maybe even making tools available if it makes sense to do so. So at the moment, with a regular Linux box, then it's a bit manual at the moment, but we are aiming to fix some of this. And there is some guidance out there on how to do it. Any other questions? We are currently, well, we've started making a list of this. So it kind of exists. It's not complete. We are, again, as the pilot goes on, part of the purpose of the pilot is to make the documentation a bit better. And that will include the list of applications that are compatible and that aren't. And where they are compatible, exactly what you need to do to enable it for that application, because it is different in every app. So currently the link under software there, the middle link, one of the links on there is application compatibility. Thanks, everyone. And as Jon has said,